And we'll get started. So we have a fair number of people who have joined already. I'm sure more will be joining. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our Green Criminology in Action webinar. And you will be able to see on the screen at the moment our panelists, everyone who will be letting us know more about this intriguing subject. And I would just like to say on behalf of IUCN Commission on Environmental, Economic, and Social Policy, welcome and welcome to the panelists. I would like to just start by introducing myself. My name is Eben Monk. I am the Executive Officer for IUCN Commission on Environmental, Economic, and Social Policy, and this webinar is organized by two of the chairs of the Green Criminology Specialist Group at IUCN Commission of Environmental, Economic, and Social Policy. That is Ines Arroyo-Quiros and Dan Van and I would just like to introduce Ines, and then Ines will take it from there. Dr. Ines Arroyo-Quiros is a biologist with a PhD in biodiversity management from the University of Kent in the UK. And she's working as a full-time researcher at the Regional Center for Multidisciplinary Research, also known as UNAM or UNAM, where she focuses on the use of animals, wildlife trade, green criminology, and the cultural representations of wildlife. And at the moment, she's working on two interdisciplinary projects, one of which is a historic perspective of the fur and leather trade from wild species involving Mexico. And the other one is representation of wild animals in Mexican cinema, a view from cultural green criminology. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Ines Arroyo-Quiros. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Eben. Good morning, everybody. Well, morning in Mexico. We'll be very, very happy to have this Green Criminology in Action webinar. We have three panelists after I give a general introduction about what green criminology is. And I'm trying to start sharing my screen, but now I will be able to. Yeah, thank you. So I will give a brief introduction on the subject and about green criminology in the context of IUCN. It's a specialist group. The work of the Commission is organized into regions, themes, that focus on key directions to meet the Commission's mandate, and also specialist groups, task forces, and working groups. So it's a very complex structure, and all the regions of the world are represented, and green criminology is part of the specialist groups. So if you are not aware of what the Commission is, CEESP is a unique network of more than 1,000 volunteers representing different perspectives and disciplines from a wide range of specialties like biology, anthropology, economics, law, cultural studies, sociology, political economics, etc. CEESP members contribute providing insight, expertise, and traditional knowledge, as well as by promoting policies and actions that relate to the human dimensions of conservation and how it relates to the development. Starting to talk about green criminology, we can define green criminology as an analytical and interdisciplinary framework from across the social and natural sciences concerned with environmental crimes and harms that affect humans, ecosystems, plants, and animals, regardless of legality. And we will learn more about this through the webinar. So a research area that focuses on environmental harm and crime, but also victimization, social and environmental justice, environmental law and regulation, moral and philosophical issues, and also we try to understand, while we work on this, on how humans, non-human animals, plants, the ecosystem, and its components are all interrelated. So this is very important. This research discipline incorporates broader conceptions of crime than provided in strictly legal definitions. Environmental harm is considered a crime in terms of social and ecologically, regardless of legality. So if there is harm to humans, environments, or plants or animals, it is considered a crime. Green Criminology recognizes that harms are committed by powerful institutions like states, corporations, military, but also it's ecocide that happens in an ordinary way by ordinary people in everyday activities. So in terms of history of the development of green criminology, in the 90s, there was a movement from criminology to take environmental crimes more seriously. In this regard, at the beginning of that decade, Lynch introduced the term green criminology, which emerged dedicated to the study of crimes and harms against nature. The movement that began in the 90s has accelerated since then through discussions, conferences, books, articles, regional networks. And so green criminology has now begun to figure in university curricula and other disciplinary fields worldwide. Green criminology highlights, for instance, the impact of global corporations and the global socioeconomic context in the development of environmental harms. Emphasizes that the permanent existence of environmental destructive behaviors has a lot to do with the nature of capitalism. Considers, for instance, the ecological and critical analysis in a world scale. And is also concerned about the perspective that sees non-human species as inferior, exploitable, and disposable. It also is concerned about consumer lifestyles, culture, and market power, and how the media shapes these behaviors and trends. Also considers, for instance, the abuse, mistreatment, and death of non-human species, for example, in global trade, both legal and illegal. And differs from conventional criminology by recognizing that harm caused to nature is a problem that needs rigorous attention, and not only when there is a breach in the legislation, but also when activities are carried out in such a manner that, although guaranteed by law, generate injustice and inequity, both social and environmental. So, green criminology is continually evolving theoretically, and intellectually is an open frame of reference. And for instance, I will give just before I introduce the first panelist, two interdisciplinary examples of recent work between green criminology and other fields of research. For instance, recently, green criminology has been used as an interdisciplinary approach to advance research on gender and wildlife crime. And although little work has been done on this topic, it is already possible to find in the literature, like this book by Agu and Gore from 2023, to find cases that offer information about the context of women and wildlife trafficking. Also, recently, there has been some work about the interaction and the dialogue between green criminology and global history, for instance. In this case, studies from conservation biology, green criminology, and global history can be intersected to help form a critical conscience that, as far as possible, contributes to avoiding new ecological disasters. Global history, for instance, can illustrate overexploitation and extermination of species throughout the human history, environmental harms, human and non-human victims, and long-term impacts. That behind the destructive of devastating practices on other species, there are economic and expansion motivations and the commodification of nature, but also cultural foundations, which are the cultural foundations of our sense of ethics and values, and the relationship we forge with nature. These are just two examples of the type of work that can be developed when we are working in green criminology. After this general introduction, I will present the first panelist today, Dr. Dan Van Oom. I will stop sharing my screen to be able to introduce Dr. Van Oom, and he is Associate Professor of Criminology, specializing he has conducted research on various forms of environmental crime, including illegal mining in Latin America, wildlife trafficking in Southeast Asia, deforestation in Central Africa, and the criminalization of ecocide. Dan obtained his PhD in criminology at Utrecht University in 2016 about the illegal wildlife trade inside the world of poachers, smugglers, and traders. In 2018, he received the Veni Grant of the Dutch Organization for Scientific Research for his research project, The Diversification of Organized Crime into the Illegal Trade in Natural Resources. And in 2022, the ERC Starting Grant, European Research Council, for the research project Green Crimes and Joint Crime Ventures, Laundering Natural Resources. Dan primarily focuses on research in the context of green crimes and harms. So now you have the microphone, Dan, and we will be very happy to learn from your work.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Ines, of the history of green criminology. Do you hear me well, and do you see the slides? Okay. I would like to share with you some insights about what we know about actors behind green crimes, the harms produced by such actors, and how we think from a green criminological point of view about eco-justice. So as we already heard from Ines, is that the emergence of green criminology indeed occurred also in the context of increasing social and professional concerns regarding the environment in the 90s. And as we know, the destruction of nature has become embedded with social, political, economic, but also global dynamics that are influenced by anthropocentric lifestyle patterns and capital accumulation. So therefore, green criminologists argue that it is important to draw attention to harms as a way of critiquing traditional definitions of crime, because crime is a social construct itself. In other words, it's dependent on the laws that are dependent on the influences of powerful actors that are sometimes also responsible for creating environmental harm. And therefore, they look at it from an expanded harm-based approach, where we look at harms against not only humans, but also ecosystems, plants, animals, and therefore they reject anthropocentric approaches and include rather broad ecocentric approaches in their study approach. I would like to discuss with you the role of the actors, because as criminologists, we know a lot about the actors behind crimes that are committed. Crimes committed both that could be considered as crimes by law, as well as crimes that are not defined by law. And this is important because we see that increasingly harms against the environment are considered as unsocial, intolerable behavior by society. A lot of harms against the environment were considered before as accepted normal behavior, state properties, but increasingly we see that this is changing. And also that some of the harms against the environment are being considered or recognized by legislation as prohibited behavior, as environmental crimes as such. So in other words, we see a sort of trend of criminalization, and that also raises questions about the actors that are involved in environmental crimes or become involved in environmental crimes because of the changes of social norms and values or the changes in laws that we see internationally. Theoretically, if we think in terms of criminal networks behind environmental crimes, such as mining, wildlife trafficking, deforestation, we think of criminal networks in terms of organized crime groups, corporate crime groups, or disorganized opportunistic crime groups, sometimes facilitated by state structures. Facilitated sometimes by particular laws or particular regulations. So in that sense, those criminal networks could be embedded in power dynamics of societies that facilitate environmental crimes as such. However, those categories of criminal networks are theoretical distinguished categories, such as an organized crime groups that are considered as organized, disciplined groups that are could be socially embedded in local communities, for example. They may use violence or corruption to facilitate illegal goods or illegal animals or services and to profit for a significant length of time. You can imagine that in local communities, it can also be a threat of organized crime groups that recruit young people to become part of their illegal activities. Another category is corporate crime networks that could be considered as legitimate formal organizations that use their business infrastructure to facilitate or to commit illegal activities under the umbrella of the corporation. So examples could include legitimate wildlife trade companies, timber companies, mining actors that have a business and use their business infrastructures to commit crimes. Another actor of criminal networks, another form of criminal networks could be disorganized and opportunistic crime groups, which are in contradiction to organized crime groups and corporate crime groups, less structures. They do not employ violence as a tool, not territorial, and not highly organized or monopolistic. However, we see in the empirical reality, based on our studies in green criminology, that in reality, those theoretical distinct categories exist in forms of joint crime ventures. In other words, we see that different types of criminal networks collaborate with each other and should be, for example, considered as joint organized corporate crime ventures or corporate disorganized opportunistic crime groups that are involved in environmental crimes. Well, based on my research, I did research in Latin America on illegal mining, for example. We see that in the context of Colombia, we see that drug cartels, but also paramilitares, guerrillas are indeed involved in illegal mining. They are dominating particular territories, but also socially embedded in local communities. So in that sense, they also play a role for local young people that live in faraway regions where illegal mining takes place, where such rather organized crime networks could also facilitate a role as have a function in terms of justice for the local people. So in other words, gold mining in Latin America, we see that on the one hand, they are socially embedded, could be connected to local communities, but also could be connected to corporations. For example, there are many examples where organized crime groups, such as drug cartels, actually control particular forms of illegal mining in Colombia, but also collaborate with a corporation that is responsible for the transport of the illegally obtained gold and export it, first launder it, and then export it to, for example, the United States or Europe, which reflects a form of organized corporate crime joint venture. We also see this, for example, the picture on the right, we see illegal mining in the setting of Colombia. We also see this in the context of wildlife trafficking in Southeast Asia, where Chinese crime groups establish a powerful role in local communities to facilitate illegal wildlife trade. And there as well, we see that they outsource particular activities to local people, in particular young people that are looking for opportunities to retrieve financial income legally or illegally. So what we see is that they outsource, for example, the activities of poaching to local communities, including indigenous communities or particular local highlanders in particular regions. We see on the picture left tiger skulls being ready for export from Shan State in Myanmar to China, where the Chinese organized crime group responsible for this collaborates in a sophisticated way with local people to outsource not only the poaching of tigers, but also in particular the smuggling of the tiger skulls across the border into China, which reflects another dimension of the criminal actors behind the criminal networks behind the illegal trade, as local individual disorganized groups of poachers collaborate with an organized Chinese crime group that facilitates wildlife trafficking in Southeast Asian setting. But also in the context of deforestation, this is an example of Eastern Congo, where I conducted research, where there are a lot of armed groups active in the field. So they occupy particular territories. So local people need to pay a particular extortion rate to get access to the rainforest, for example, to retrieve timber or retrieve charcoal for cooking. So their territorial control also results in different power dynamics, with on the one hand armed crime groups that are collaborating or are sometimes also socially embedded in local communities that need, for example, timber for cooking, or that need timber for livelihoods, but also that armed groups provide access to the rainforest to corporate actors, to corporations that facilitate the trade of tropical timber out of the rainforest of Eastern Congo and export the timber, for example, via Uganda all the way to Asian or European countries, reflecting another form of joint crime ventures in the empirical reality. When green criminologists look at justice, it is important to keep in mind that there are different forms of justice, how we consider humans in relation to the natural environment, but also how we deal with environmental justice as such, as an extension of human and social rights, or human and environmental rights, to enhance the quality of life. So in particular, when we talk about local communities that are dependent of the forest, that are, for example, polluted by illegal mining, or that are affected by poaching or deforestation, but it can also be because of powerful organized crime groups or armed groups that force local people to to move to other places because they occupy territories or lands with highly valued natural resources, natural wealth. So in other words, environmental justice raises a lot of questions in relation to land, local people, but also criminal actors that try to exploit the natural environment, which affects human and environmental rights simultaneously. Also, ecological justice is an important concept which refers to humans as just one component of complex ecosystems that should preserve for their own sake. So we are talking about the quality of the biosphere and rights to the environment. We see increasingly discussions about the rights of particular ecosystems, of particular rivers, that could also be embedded in terms of ecological justice. What are the rights that are affected by the criminal entities in the natural environment? And finally, also species justice refers to the harm constructed in relation to the place of non-human animals within environments, as well as their intrinsic value. So what does, for example, deforestation means for, well, biodiversity, for endangered species, but also for how individual animals experience the threats from an intrinsic value perspective. So therefore, green criminologists expand their theoretical and intellectual scope by rejecting anthropocentric approaches of crime and harm and justice, by acknowledging ecocentric and biocentric approaches into their theoretical perspectives. And this raises important criminological and law-oriented questions about, for example, the perpetrator and victim continuum, but also about responsibility, accountability, and a duty of care of the near future. So I think what we try to explain here is that green criminology is concerned with all those theoretical, but also empirical strategies that we use to uncover injustices, as well as crimes legally defined by law and crimes that are actually not legally defined by law, but can be legally defined by law in the near future, taking into account the trends of criminalization. Thank you. This was my presentation. So I think we move forward now with the second presenter.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. If you could stop sharing your screen, I will then introduce you to our next speaker. And we're very happy to have Dr. Judith Rakowski. She's currently a member of the Conservation Criminology Lab within the Department of Geographical Sciences at the University of Maryland, College Park. She holds a bachelor's and master's degree in global change geography from Humboldt University, Berlin, Germany. She has worked in South Africa, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan on different projects focusing on protected area effectiveness, species management, and ecotourism. For that, she collaborated with organizations such as the Worldwide Fund for Nature, Yerevan State University, and the Agency of Protected Areas. Before joining the University of Maryland, Judith worked at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research and the German Center for Integrated Biodiversity Research. During her tenure, she worked on European Commission projects addressing the Common European Agricultural Policy, bird conservation, and stakeholder engagement. Her current work is focused on wildlife crime prevention in Vietnam and Mexico. We welcome Judith. Thank you very much for being here with us in IUCN. I think your microphone is off.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm just about to adjust my my presentation. Okay, here we go. Thank you very much for this introduction. And yeah, my name is Judith Rakowski, and I will be talking about like green criminology and wildlife crime prevention on the ground. And I will do so by giving you some examples from one of our projects in Vietnam. And how do I... All right, here we go. So as we have heard already, wildlife crime is a worldwide problem, and in the past decades, oftentimes the response has been law enforcement to tackle this problem. However, unfortunately, this has not been like enough to stop wildlife crime from happening, and therefore, in the last time, more and more projects and works research is focusing on wildlife crime prevention efforts. And that is what our lab is doing as well. We're working in South Africa, in Kenya, in Mozambique, in different places of the world, and as well Vietnam, which I think is a good example. And therefore, I want to talk about that a little bit more to give you some insights on how green criminology can work on the ground. Before I delve into the project, I want to say that conservation criminology and wildlife crime prevention on the ground always is embedded in a socio-ecological context. So on the one hand, the human side, but also the natural side. And they are connected over time and space, and dependencies exist, feedback loops exist, power structures may be in place, which have to be considered if we want to do meaningful work. And I will also get back to this when I explain a little bit more about our project. So Vietnam is among the top 10 countries affected by the illegal wildlife trade worldwide. And one of the reasons, there are several, but one of them is its beautiful biodiversity. It is one of the biodiversity hotspots worldwide. And our project is focusing on Pumat National Park, which you can like see located up here. It's like rather in the north of the country, bordering Laos. And here in the middle, you see the protected area, its core zone and the buffer zone stretching over 7 different communes in Nghệ An region. Pumat National Park has been established in 2001 and is one of the most important sites in Vietnam for mammal conservation and rewilding, as you can see on the right-hand side, such as the Annamite striped rabbit, for example, or the white-cheeked gibbon. And at the same time, in this protected area in the buffer zone, also do live 6 different ethnic groups. And the establishment of this protected area has, well, forced some of them to resettle, has forced others to like totally change their lifestyle, as many of them have been like living off the forest. So that is important to keep in mind, this context for like the work that we are doing. The project is focused on reducing illegal wildlife trade or wildlife crime in Pumat National Park. At the moment, estimations are that 70% are gone of the species that used to live there, or the wildlife that used to live there, but there's still hope that this can be recovered. So the focus is on reducing the wildlife crime and also enhancing guardianship. I want to talk about 2 approaches that we are using, different methods. One of them is called place network investigations, and the second one is general strain theory. Both are borrowed from criminology. Place network investigation is a spatial pattern approach. And if you think about it, so usually on crime maps, we would see the crime sites only. So in our case, where are the snares? Where is the hunting happening? But at the same time, it is also very interesting and helpful to think, so which other spaces do support the crime from happening. So comfort spaces, corruption spots, or convergence spaces, such as where do the individuals, as the offenders, go? Where do they buy the materials? Where do they store? Where do they do different things? And knowing and mapping these places helps us to have a broader way for intervention strategies. General strain theory focuses on emotions and the social environment of offenders, and the idea is basically strains trigger negative emotions such as anger or fear, and these negative emotions then lead to a coping mechanism. So for example, if I do not have enough food, let's say I cannot buy it because I don't have work in the place where I live, there is no work that I could do, then I might do illegal activities, such as in our case, for example, illegal hunting, in order to provide enough for my family. So how does that look in practice? We have been to Vietnam last year for 2 months and did field work there in place like in Pumat National Park that looks like that. And overall, yeah, we have sampled over 21 villages and talked to more than like 190 people. So being on the ground really is like going into conversations with people, like being in the space. And we have used methods such as like participatory mapping, either with, as you can see here, pen and paper, sometimes with digital maps, or like focus group discussions, interviews, different approaches to understand how the situation is on the ground. And I just want to show you like some very brief examples. So on the left side here, you see like the 4 different villages from our sample in January last year with a different strain dimensions. And just as a visual comparison, you see that in these 2 villages down here, many more strain dimensions are coming up. So that means apparently more problems are happening for or are impacting the people who are living there. Comparing this with the data that the crime site data that we got from the rangers patrolling in that park, you might see that like, oh, there is a hotspot as well at the exact same spot as the strains. So there might be an overlap, and it might be like interesting and important for the management of the park, but also like NGOs who are working there to focus on these these spots. The same, just to show you like how that can look when we like delve more into it. Again, the same question, the strains up here, and you can see more problems at one side of the park. So these are the strain counts. Here at the other side, you would see the different strain types and negative emotions. And also thinking about, okay, like not everyone who like is strained at the same time becomes like an offender, right? So what are the connections between problems that people have, negative emotions, potentially injustice, and then also looking at the map down here, which is the crime place network of my colleague. This also shows us a spatial pattern, and like being on the ground for us, for me as well as a geographer in particular, I want to say it is very interesting to think how does the crime, but also the supporting activities, the network, how is that like how is that distributed over place and space, so that we can address it in a shaped way. So yeah, that is what I want you to take away. What I'm taking away from these maps is that space and context matter, and that these conditions shape like how people are affected, and this influences the behavior of people. I'm not going to go into this more in detail, but if you have more questions, I'm very happy to answer them. Before I end, what I really want to say is that being on the ground matters a lot. And of course, like these information or like these data that we have collected in over these 2 months are very insightful. And I would say, and I imagine like my colleagues would like probably agree with me, is that like spending time in the context is very important. So sitting with the people and potentially drinking a lot of rice wine, for example, while talking, what is going on, what are the problems, how is the network of the actors, is important. Also down here, understanding how the livelihoods work of the people. So how much rice can they actually produce? How long does it take? Is that rice enough to feed the village in that area, or do they have to bring in additional groceries? What is the situation of the road? How bad is that? And how does this, for example, affect education or medical services? And then also what I said in the beginning, what have been the traditions of the people living in this protected area in that context, and how are they affected by the law, but also by the depletion of the natural resources, for example, that they used to live on. So these are just like some brief insights that I want to share. And I think it is important, or what I want to like, highlight is how important it is to think about these different contexts, so that then we can do meaningful work, both for like the people, but also the nature, and like really tie this together to reconciliate the needs of both sides. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments, either in the chat or after the last presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Judith. I will now present our next speaker. Well, she maybe put her presentation while I present. We welcome Dr. Carolina Sanchez. She's a philosopher. She's working currently at the Utrecht University. She's an ecofeminist scholar that has dedicated her academic work to environmental ethics and the theory of justice for nature. Her expertise resides in ecosystems ethics and ancestral knowledge, indigenous sacred places, its international legality, and the southern epistemologies. She has done most of her fieldwork bridging, comparing and contrasting policies for environmental protection and the emergence of epistemic resistance in the Mapuche communities of South Chile. She's also involved in research with struggles for preserving the tropical forests, such as the indigenous communities of Ecuador, particularly the Sarayaku community and their concept of Cossack Sacha, which means living forest, Sumac Camaña and Sumac Causay, which means buen vivir. Her teaching philosophy is based on critical thinking for liberation, on learning and relearning beyond modernity, because as Boaventura de Sousa Santos says, there can be no global justice without global cognitive justice. Please, we welcome Carolina.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I think I'm gonna share my slides too to start this conversation. Do you see it? Yes?
Yes, it should be maybe in a presentation mode, but yes, we can see it.
Yes, you see it? Okay.
If you could put it in a presentation mode,
Okay.
it would be better.
Is it good? I do not know how to put it in presentation mode, but can you see me and can you see the slides?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah. Okay, so my presentation today is about Mapu Sofi or Mapu Sofia in Spanish of environmental conflicts, the Mapuche Gulumapu and the subantarctic lands. Yes, I mean Mapu Sofi, I'm talking about ethics and the role of ethics and ethical thinking in environmental conflicts in the south of Chile and Argentina, mostly with indigenous Mapuche people. That is what I did, what I have been doing, and where all my publications are. It is true, I'm a philosopher, I'm a legal philosopher, and I do legal anthropology, but with a philosophical angle. So many of the terminology here today might be different from, might differ a bit from what you do. So if you have some question, please don't hesitate to ask me. Green criminology, as you can imagine, in 2021, there was some data published about biodiversity in the world. And it is said that 80% of the global still existing biodiversity in the world exists in indigenous territories. Yes. So you can imagine that for green criminologists as you, this might be a ground for working. But for me as a philosopher, as a legal philosopher, it is interesting to know why is still so much biodiversity. What principles are regulating that that flourishing of life, and how do they emerge in environmental conflicts and law cases? So I went to an investigation of that first, just mapping some ideas, and I found out some important conceptualizations in indigenous territories. I have summarized some of them here. In indigenous territories of Argentina and Chile, where the Mapuche communities are, you have the Kumemoyen, and that's a way of understanding the living well with the other. That means the inclusion of humans and the more than human. I do not call it no human because I do not like that terminology. Then you have the Causaxacha, the conceptualization of the idea of the forest as a sentient being from the Pueblo Quichua, the Sarayaku from Ecuador. You also have the Sumacao side that has been included in constitutions, but actually in a community is a principle of governance, of ecological governance, I would say. Then you have the Senti Pensar from the Cimarron communities, thinking and feeling life close to the manglar ecosystems in Colombia. You have the same kind of principles in USA and of course in New Zealand. And these principles have been very key to acknowledge certain rights in terms of cultures and our relations of to the environment. So the principle, the Kumemoyen I'm going to talk today, it is located here. You can see in the small map how the nation state configures Argentina and Chile into two lands, and the claim for rights and land rights of the Mapuche people, which cuts the countries in two. Yes, there is 1 million Mapuche people inhabiting those lands, and there are a lot of environmental conflicts there. There are two environmental conflicts I worked with. I wanted to understand how this ethics with the land worked and why these communities were opposed to certain projects or corporative projects. And there was one corporative project that was the installation of wind turbines in a sacred place. And the Machi, the leader of this group, was thinking how I'm going to explain to the people that we have to oppose a project that seems to be so much needed. Clean energies are needed, and indigenous people know about it. But the problem is that the area where the program wanted to be, where the wind turbines wanted to be installed, was in a sacred place for them, where millenarian trees still exist from the last glaciation. So, and they have the power to absorb much more CO2 than whatever machine we have invented until now. So the role of the Kumamoyan, the
Carolina,
Mapuches played an enormous role there.
sorry, excuse me, but I cannot see the next slide. So would it be
You
possible
cannot see the
to?
slides.
No, I only see the first slide, and I think others cannot see the other slide as well. So could you please? Yeah, now we can see it. Perfect.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you so much.
Yes. So I was working. This is one of the conflicts I worked with. Is a conflict that that was not solved actually by environmental law. It was solved by the opposition and resistance of indigenous communities together with civil society. So there were two groups involved there with very different belief systems, yeah, that could communicate at one point around this case. There, the focus was the complete contestation of the idea of development, yes, and development with green technologies. That was for me a very important point, because how, at this moment, are you going to oppose something like that? Well, they say it's greenwashing, and it was not clear for me at the time, but it's very clear that it is a greenwashing, because the trees that were still present and they managed to save in that place are much more efficient in the capture of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Yes. So yeah. So there it popped up for me. Okay, what are we really discussing here with environmental crimes, and how we can approach this? And because it's very difficult to talk about clean energies and be angry about that, but yeah, the problem is that we are living in an era with modern problems without modern solutions. And Dan asked me to tell today what are the contributions of indigenous people, and one of them is that the need to see land as a ground for developing justice, for developing law, as a primary source of law. And that implies to acknowledge the acknowledgement of pluriversality. And pluriversality is, like the Zapatistas in Mexico put it in 1994, a long time ago, a war where many wolves feed, as a way of going out of this massive destruction. For me, it's going from the right to live to the right to exist as both parallel and needed things. And human rights solve this with rights, human rights, different rights, right to live, right to water, right to this and that and that. And I was thinking, but if we have all these marvelous rights, what else? Why they are not so effective in stopping destruction? So that was the second motivation to exploring indigenous contributions to understand green destruction, of ecological destruction. So there is when I found all these concepts. We are gonna go to a bit more further. So what can we learn about that? One of the main things that I learned in these conflicts is that for indigenous people, the sentience, the capacity of talk, intelligence, cognition of the more than human is very much present. People are risking their lives with professional mercenaries sometimes in these conflicts, putting their risks at risk their eyes and many of their lives for these beliefs, for the dignity of all these beings, as they call them, because they don't call them nature. And just what I call the emergence of indigenous paradigm in socio-environmental conflicts. In a translation would be the right to exist as a species, being or the more than human, which is not nature. I came to the conclusion that the idea of nature is complicated in this to understand their opposition and the resistance to projects or corporative projects of all kind in indigenous lands. That will not say that they are opposed to green technologies. Most of them are very much in favor of solar energy, even wind powers, but there are certain sacred places where they do not allow, and they have tried to implement the consultation.
Carolina?
Yes.
Hi, this is Eben. Sorry to interrupt you. I'm afraid we're running out of time. Would you be able to wrap up your presentation?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, because of these ideas, there is a lot of criminalization of indigenous people. Many people are dying. But the message of them is like you will hear while our lives continue, our readers continue talking, it is our duty to listen and to defend them. Philosophy and cosmology, we learning how to connect with what you call in the West nature. And Mapuche communities are becoming active subjects for teaching non-Mapuche at grassroots and non-formal levels, localizing human rights. Does not point to universalism, like I said. It points to pluriversalism and ethics and other ways of relating to the territory. For all these ideas, like Marisol La Cadena puts it, we are facing a time where the current destruction of indigenous walls is historically unparalleled. The destruction of walls and resistance to it has acquired a scope and speed that early extirpators of idolatries and 19th century explorers could envy. The most relevant cases are Berta Cáceres, Macarena Valdés, but yearly the criminalization, the murder of indigenous defendants of ecology, of the environment is very high. It's very high. I think the last year was 73, 83 people that died. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. Now we have some questions in the chat. We already have answer from Dr. Judy Rakowski through the chat from one of the persons who wrote. Thank you, Judith. And I think we have one more that might be maybe good, if Dan maybe could answer from Rainer Ude. He's interested in measures to reduce and effectively manage wildlife crime and green criminology. I don't know if you could say something just about this briefly, as if we're running out of time.
Yes, I think, thank you for the question. What is important to understand if you would like to reduce wildlife crime is, of course, also highlighted by my colleague, the socioeconomic dimension surrounding the wildlife crime places, but also the cultural aspects of it. Can be about the cultural demand or the cultural circumstances of the people surrounding the wildlife crime places, but also about the political setting. So we try to map out all those different influences that contribute to wildlife crime in order to draw attention to measures that could prevent or react to wildlife crime effectively. And I think the context of criminalization is important there to keep in mind that some of the actors that see or consider their activities not as a crime. So from that point of view, it is a contested perspective. So if it's being considered as business as usual, you have to understand that to effectively tackle the wildlife crime problem. In other words, it should be embedded in the local communities, but also should take into account what are the cultural rules, rather than only the rules on paper or enforced by the government.
Thank you, Dan. That's the last part was really important, and I completely agree. So looking at the time, I will share my screen briefly to give some final remarks on the webinar. And so we've been looking, when we talk about green criminology, we've been learning through this webinar that maybe we could have a longer one next time, so we can talk about more projects on the ground. Green criminology is an interdisciplinary work. It's a worldwide problem. It touches all the regions. It could be analyzed over time and through space in different places. We learn about the different types and structure of criminal networks, like mining, wildlife trade, deforestation, and how these interact with other corporations and how this touches local communities in different ways. We learned that there are different types of justice: socio-environmental justice, ecological, species justice. The work in green criminology is both theoretically and empirical work, and we learned some examples on this. It's possible to work on the ground, developing, specifically working with the local people, developing networks, to understand the context of the criminal sites, placing, with the help of the local people, key crime sites through participatory mapping as well. It's important to know the impacts on people on these crimes, and that's why we talk about socio-environmental justice. And based on all this type of work, we can propose strategies, always talking to people on the ground as well, to develop these strategies and not implement or impose strategies in a vertical way, but through the common dialogue with the people that is actually involved in these problems, no? So finally, the idea that criminal law can or should be the only solution to the problems of environmental harm is erroneous. So this type of work, it should be holistic, interdisciplinary, taking into account all the multi-factors involved, taking into account nature and people. There is much to change and much to challenge if we are to respond to the global ecological crisis or socio-ecological crisis. And so finally, I don't know if panelists agree, but I think that doing green criminology requires a sense of scale, to have very, a sense of interconnectedness in issues, in events, places, taking into account all Earth inhabitants from a non-anthropocentric perspective, which was also mentioned throughout the webinar, and taking into account, which was mentioned in the last presentation, to establish modes of knowledge and developing knowledge production, ensuring the rights and lives from a global South perspective as well. And I think, well, at the end, when we look at green criminology in the context of IUCN, and this is especially for young people listening, I think we should all be working in a transversal way throughout all the specialist groups, regions. We need help from young professionals, working groups, and all the thematic groups, because we are as I mean, this is a scheme that exemplifies where is green criminology placed within the context of IUCN. But I place all the circles in green because we should all be working together and not in a separate way to identify the problems. We need help from all the other groups working in the IUCN to gather the evidence, to make all the connections through disciplines, to construct the arguments, and as we learned today through the webinar, to analyze case by case, taking into account context, geographical patterns, cultural, and ensure social and environmental rights in our proposals when we try to give recommendations on a certain problem in certain area. So for my part, this is like a type of final remarks from the webinar. I don't know if I want to thank IUCN and CEESP for supporting us in giving this webinar. And I think we should have more throughout the year and have more time to do this kind of activities, maybe some activity, not through the online, but presence. We should aim on doing that. So I want to thank Judith, Dan, and Carolina. And Dan, as the co-chair of the Green Criminology Specialist Group, you want to give like a final comment or something, or even?
Yes, thanks a lot for being with us today, and we are looking forward to collaborate also with other interest groups of IUCN, but also people across the world. Thanks for being with us, and thanks again for all the amazing presenters and the opportunity to have this webinar today, of course. Thank you, Iben.
Yeah, I don't know if you have time, if people is around. We have one more last question. I don't know if I could read it, even though we already say goodbye, but I don't know. Yeah, okay. So it says, hello, I'm Muhatba Masari, a PhD student from Central European University. My research focuses on green criminology, and I would like to inquire whether the presenters have introduced any active volunteer groups in the field of environmental criminology. I would like to be part of the group or lab. Yeah, well, this is we're working as part of the Green Criminology Specialist Group, and you could, through the webpage of the IUCN and CEESP Commission, you can solicit to be part of this group if you're already working on this subject, and something about that, even some specific instruction.
I would recommend, I put the link both to the Green Criminology Specialist Group in the answer to you, and also a link to how you could apply to become a member of the commission, and then you would indicate that you would be interested in joining the Green Criminology Specialist Group. And I would recommend that you put in your application that you have listened to this webinar as well, and what your background is. So we would love to have you on board. But thank you so much, everybody. And if there are any more questions you want to highlight, Ines, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. No. Just wanted to say that maybe Bashari can give the next talk in the next event. So we learn from her. And for me, that's all. And thank you very much, Carolina, Judith.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It was very interesting.
Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate your expertise and your contributions. Thank you for taking the time today to join us.
See you soon.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.